Welcome to NBA Jam Tatman QC on Fire Edition. Boom shakalaka!
Happy little games. Growing up in the cornfields of Illinois, where we first learned to eat corn the long way, I fell in love with the game of bowling. My entire family were bowlers, including my older brother, who was on the PBA tour for a short time until almost completely severing his thumb due to a work accident. My dad has told stories of setting me down at the foul line in my diaper with a bowling ball directly in front of me so I could push it down the lane. I've also been a league bowler since I was 5 years old, and it's just something I have always enjoyed. Today, this video is selfishly done by me for me. I have always wanted to talk in depth about this game, so hopefully you find it interesting. One of my all-time favorite bowling games growing up is the 8-bit simulation 10th Frame, and it was released by Access Software all the way back in 1986. This game features realistic physics, fantastic rotoscope animation, and best of all, the sport of bowling. I am such a huge fan of this game that I even wrote a letter to Retro Gamer magazine years ago, and it was actually published. I even called and spoke with the developers when I was a kid, but more on that in just a bit. What was the hardware protection that was required for the American version of this game? What homebrew used a version of this game for its console release? Why was this game almost canceled halfway through development? Let's find out as we take a look at 10th Frame from Access Software. In the Patman QC household, growing up, I had my fair share of bowling toys. From the plastic pins, to Snoopy bowling, to electronic bowling games, and my all-time favorite tabletop bowling game, which I literally had 3 or 4 growing up, was the Coleco Bowl-a-matic 300. Let me just show you the commercial for that game really quick because it was so cool, especially in the mid-1970s.
He's coming! He's coming!
Sheriff, I'm gonna have you rolling in the gutter.
Not if I strike first.
Bowl-a-matic 300.
Bowl-a-matic 300.
Right up my alley.
Bowl-a-matic 300. The new kind of bowling game with all the excitement of the real thing. Spares, splits, strikes, and an automatic pin setter.
Gotcha. You'll need a turkey to beat me.
1, 2, 3.
You're the first straight bowling sheriff I ever met. Hey, the sheriff won! The sheriff won! Sheriff won now!
Sheriff, why do they call it Bowl-a-matic 300?
Because that's the name of the game.
Bowl-a-matic 300 by Coleco. A game where good guys finish first.
When it comes to video games that attempted to translate the sport of bowling onto screens all across the world, the one most people are familiar with is the game Bowling on the Atari 2600. This one turned out really good for what it was, and I spent countless hours playing against my older brother attempting to get a 300 game. After receiving a Commodore 64 back in 1985, there was only one game I was aware of for that machine, and it was called 5-pin bowling. I never knew what 5-pin bowling was. I just assumed it was a technical limitation of the 64 and that it wouldn't allow 10 pins on screen at once. I also noticed that the score didn't seem quite right when compared to the American version of 10-pin. It was a fun, fast-paced arcade game, and I never realized until years later, thanks to YouTube, that it's actually a real game that is played up in Canada. Bowling video games got a huge step up in 1986 thanks to Bruce and Roger Carver and Access Software. Access Software was started by Bruce Carver and Chris Jones all the way back in 1982. The company got its start after Bruce had created a sprite editing program called Sprite Master. After consulting with Steve Witzel, who had suggested a number of improvements, they started selling the title under the Access Software banner. The name Access is a combination of Action Software and Centersoft. They produce some truly innovative games with fantastic playability and animation, including Beachhead and Raid Over Moscow. While the previous titles turned out to be very successful for the company, what put them on the map was its series of golf games starting in 1986 with Leaderboard. At the time, most golf games used a top-down approach, whereas the team wanted to create a golf game that was shown from directly behind the player. Instead of a fast-paced arcade-style game, they wanted to create a true simulation of the sport, including realistic wind and ball physics. Since the majority of the team didn't have the artistic chops to create such a title, they decided to try rotoscope footage of an actual golfer and implement that into the game. They started with a standard VHS camcorder and recorded Roger Carver's golf swing, tracing each frame onto a clear sheet of paper. They then converted each of these frames into sprites onto the Commodore 64. They were allowed 32 frames of animation for the golfer, and it was truly revolutionary for its time. Computer games had used rotoscoping in the past in titles such as Karateka, but this was the first time that it was used for a sports simulation. This game proved to be both a critical and commercial success, with a number of follow-ups and update discs released, including new courses and improved graphics. The company of Access Software would go on to release a number of other innovative products, such as the graphic adventure game Mean Streets, which starred Tex Murphy utilizing digitized graphics. They also released the blatant ripoff of the arcade game Narc by the name of Crime Wave. This game actually hit the streets before the official conversion of Narc, which was released by Ocean Software, and I'm surprised there was never a lawsuit. However, after the widely successful Leaderboard Golf, the idea was floated about doing a bowling game. Thanks to the warranty cards that were sent back in from Leaderboard Golf, there was interest in the company doing a bowling game. The dev team from Leaderboard got together and they all agreed that it would be something that would be viable, but one thing right out of the gate was that it would be more of a simulation similar to Leaderboard and not the arcade-style fast gameplay as found in bowling for the Atari 2600. They had recorded a bowler going through the motion similar to Leaderboard just to see if it would work, and it looked great. Something else they decided to do was digitize a strike to go along with the rotoscope bowler. They put this demo together to show off at various conventions, and the reaction was positive. The demo looked great, but once Bruce realized the thousands of pin combinations that were possible, he came to the conclusion that digitization would not be feasible. After going back to utilizing sprites, something else he didn't consider were the pins flying around at a realistic pace and not slowing the machine down. Similar to Leaderboard, 10th frame was designed on a Commodore 64 with a clock speed of right around 1 MHz. This was going to be the first stumbling block in the development of the title. Bruce worked on this problem for 3 weeks and actually thought about canceling the title, deeming it wasn't possible. This was when the light bulb went off in his head. He decided to treat the pins as if they were billiard balls, which drastically simplified the physics. The pins could not move vertically, but they were able to fly around left and right. He solved this problem using mathematical equations of motion, which are calculated for each pin and for the ball. This is based on ball speed, hook, and angle into the pocket, and also the number of pins on the alley. The entire sequence is calculated before the ball actually gets to the pin area. As soon as the game starts up, you'll notice that it looks like you are actually in a bowling alley. You are right smack in the middle of the center on lanes 5 and 6, and you'll see the pin setter drop the pins and raise back up. The attention to detail is fantastic, with such little treats as the dots on the masking unit telling you which pins are still standing, which was something of a mainstay in bowling alleys during this time frame. Even the scoring sheet looks like an actual bowling sheet that was used before computerized scoring came along. The sweep comes down in between frames and removes the pins that are knocked over. Keep in mind, this was done 40 years ago on an 8-bit machine. This is all very realistic and something that was extremely cool to see if you were a bowling and video game fan. Since the game required a lot of moving parts, during development the team hit another stumbling block when they ran out of sprites. On the good old Commodore 64, only 8 sprites were available. The bowler required 6, The ball used 1 and the last remaining sprite went to the marker. Since everything is on the same horizontal line, a raster trick could not be utilized so the graphics could display correctly. According to Roger Carver, what we had to do was horizontally split the screen in two. When you throw a ball, it remains the same sprite on both sides of the line. The 6 sprites that were used for the bowler at the bottom of the screen are the same sprites being used for the pins and other things above. 2 sprites are needed for the pins. The pin setter requires a sprite and the sweep uses another sprite. This is why the bowler disappears when the sweep comes down. Once they worked out the sprites and bowling pin issues, they moved full steam ahead and sought out a professional bowler to use as the basis for the main sprite. After videotaping the man in action, they deemed that his style was not quite conventional enough as the duo wanted to see a more generic approach. Since Roger was an actual bowler, Bruce convinced him to go through his bowling motion and saw that it was exactly what they were looking for. Similar to Leaderboard, it required 32 frames to display the sequence of the bowler throwing the ball. Speaking of the professional bowler, he did have his time to shine, or at least the back of him did, as this was the man who appeared on the box for the game. While the game couldn't handle the thousands of directions that the pins fly around in real life, they were able to calculate around 100 or so different combinations. The play mechanics from Leaderboard also make a return utilizing the 3-click approach. You initially line up your shot and then hold the fire button to start your approach. Depending on when you release the button will determine how fast your ball speed is, and the second button press indicates the hook. Similar to the speed, you can choose minimum or maximum, but with the hook you can throw either a straight ball, a medium hook, or maximum. You have to press the button in the yellow bar for this to actually work. If you miss the yellow bar and you stop it in the red area, this produces an error and the ball doesn't do what you want it to do. The overall sequence is essentially push the button to start, release it to set the speed, and push it again to set the hook. Similar to real bowling, the speed will affect how much the ball will curve or hook as it goes down the lane. If you throw it with less speed, it will maximize the overall hook of the ball. The disc-based US version included a dongle or anti-copy device that is needed to run the game. This is plugged directly into the back of the system where the dataset is normally plugged into. There is no copy protection on the disc, so you are allowed to easily make a backup copy, but you definitely need the dongle in order for it to run. When the game first came out, I immediately bought a copy and took it to a friend's house where we played it until early the next morning. He was a bowler as well and loved how realistic it was. He said he was going to get a copy of it the next day. I called him a few days later, offering to bring the game over so we could play it. He said no because his Commodore 64 wasn't working. Apparently he had downloaded a pirate copy off of a local BBS, but this version wasn't fully cracked. Some alligator clips had to be used as an imitation dongle, but he ended up hooking it up to the wrong port and it fried his motherboard. This dongle would not be used in versions across the pond because tape drives were still the medium of choice as floppy drives were deemed too expensive. When the game was released, it was another critical and financial hit for the company. Depending on which version you had, a nice title screen opened up the game with the 16-bit versions featuring a nice digitized bowler that was taken straight from the box. When the game starts up, it asks you a number of questions such as league play or open bowling. In league play, you can have teams with up to 4 players. If you choose open bowling, it immediately asks you to enter the player's name and the ability. There are 3 different skills available, including Kids, which is the starter level with you essentially throwing a straight ball, Amateur, which allows you to set your spin and hook and also room for a little bit of error, and Professional, which allows for more speed and hook, but accuracy is a huge factor. As I mentioned, the graphics are excellent with the bowler walking down the lane with animation smooth as silk. While the pin physics are not 100% realistic, they do fly around and spin like they do in real life for the most part. Every so often, a messenger or flying pin will come shooting across, taking out other pins in the process. Bowling ball and pin physics are the hardest thing to get right, and the team at Access Software back in 1986 got it spot on for the most part. Even the bowling ball as it's rolling down the lane is realistic. If you are throwing a ball with a lot of curve, the finger holes should be turning clockwise. If you are throwing it straight with no hook, they should be rolling from top to bottom. These all happen in this game. There's nothing that irks me more in a bowling game when I am throwing the ball to the left and the finger holes are turning in the opposite direction. Again, it's the little details that are appreciated. Once the game is complete, if you have a printer, it gives you the option of printing out a score sheet. It's a very cool little feature. After playing the game for a couple of months, I started to think about improvements they could make to the game. I decided to give the company a call and offer my suggestions. Even though I was only 11 at the time, apparently my BS was good enough because somehow I got past reception and spoke to Roger Carver himself. I asked him if there was going to be any updates to 10th Frame, such as the course discs they had done for Leaderboard. He kind of laughed under his breath and asked what kind of updates they could possibly do. I suggested perhaps left-handed bowlers, bowling on different lanes, and possibly having the guy turn around and show his face when you bowl a high score. He just laughed it off, and that was the end of the conversation. Needless to say, no updates were ever released. The absolute best retro gaming magazine in existence, which just happens to be Retro Gamer Magazine, did an article on Access Software all the way back in issue 120. They talked a lot about the creation of their various games, but only mentioned 10th Frame in passing. So I decided to send them an email regarding the slight, and to my shock and amazement, they published my letter in issue 124. According to Batman QC, "Hello. I have been a subscriber for almost 5 years and a regular purchaser since issue 11. I have always enjoyed your magazine, especially the coin-op conversions. Being from the States, I grew up on the Commodore 64 and Amiga, so I really look forward seeing what machines were popular in Europe during this time frame. This is my first letter and wanted to express my disappointment in your Access Software article in issue 120. I was very disappointed in the lack of coverage on their early title 10th Frame. It was mentioned just in passing when referring to Leaderboard. I admit that it wasn't anywhere near as popular as the golf sim, but it was the first bowling sim and deserved a little more recognition. The ball and pin physics are something that some publishers are still having trouble with, yet almost 30 years ago, Bruce Carver had it pretty much down. The game was released for a number of systems, but the one that holds a special place in my heart would be the Commodore 64 version. Everything looks and sounds great, although things are a tiny bit on the slow side at certain points. No matter which version you fire up, you are greeted with a rather well-drawn title screen. For those of you who don't know, a homebrew company by the name of CollectorVision have done a number of homebrew ports for various systems, including the ColecoVision. They ported over the MSX version of 10th Frame to the Coleco and released it on an actual cartridge. They were kind enough to send me over a ROM of the Coleco port so I could check it out for this video. It's basically the MSX version, although it does have a couple of additional bells and whistles. A brand new title screen is shown, as well as digitized sound effects whenever the ball hits the pins. The gameplay is extremely fast, so you must be on your toes. The pins don't fly around quite as much as they did in the 64 or the MS-DOS version, but overall it's not too bad. Speaking of the MSX, this port turned out okay, although the title screen is a little wonky, with the bowling pin looking like something I once found on my grandmother's bedside table. The lane detail isn't bad, although there isn't a whole lot of color. The animation of the bowler looks really nice, and the gameplay is nice and smooth, although it is a bit fast. As a matter of fact, the game suffers from a little fast and then slow animation when it comes to the bowling ball rolling down the lane and then knocking the pins over. Speaking of pins, they don't fly around as much as they do in the Commodore 64 port or other versions. There is no music, and the semi-digitized sounds found in the ColecoVision port are nowhere to be found. When it comes to the rest of the 8-bit conversions that were released for the micros all across Europe, they all tend to look quite alike. The Amstrad version looks fairly nice with some nice, fairly vibrant colors, but there's just not a whole lot to them. Everything is painted in blues and browns, and that includes the bowler himself. The pin action is also a bit on the slow side, as is the gameplay. The sound effects are very minimal. The Spectrum port looks very similar to the Amstrad, although with a bit less color. The speed of the game is also slower, which you can definitely see in the pin action. They also don't fly around anywhere near as realistic as other versions. There is also no sound to speak of. The creme de la creme in terms of audio and visuals would go to the 16-bit Atari ST version. We are presented with a fantastic digitized title screen with some gorgeous graphics and of course the animation. The sound effects have also been massively improved with sampled sounds of the bowling ball rolling down the lane and of course the smash of the pins when the ball makes contact. If you get a spare or a strike, there's even digitized clapping and cheering. What lets this version down though is the controls itself. This was an early Atari ST game, so the only control method is the mouse, and if you are a stubby and nubby person like myself, you'll find this is not the preferred way to play. With that being said, it's still excellent, and since no Amiga conversion was ever done, this is as good as it gets for the 16-bit platforms. The MS-DOS version was released in pure putrid CGA mode, which makes all the colors look a bit on the crappy side. The gameplay though is where it excels, and it's right on par with the Commodore 64 version. Everything feels a bit snappier and faster as far as the animation and the playability. The audio is pure PC beeper, so there's nothing to get excited about there. It does play great, and that's all that matters. And finally we come to my absolute favorite, which is the Commodore 64 version. Everything about this game is top notch, and although the graphics and the audio aren't on the same level as the Atari ST, it's still fantastic stuff. The animation is excellent, and so is the audio. There are times when the game does seem to slow down just a tad, but overall it is fantastic. An NES conversion was also planned, but it was canceled at the last minute. And there you have it, folks, the documentary that most people didn't want, but I had a whole lot of fun making. The game is almost 40 years old, and for a bowling video game purist like myself, it still holds up. Sure, it's been toppled since then, but way back in 1986, when playing this for the first time, my jaw hit the floor when I saw how realistic it was. If you've never had the chance to put on some stinky bowling shoes, all the while picking out the perfect ball to throw that perfect strike, be sure and give 10th Frame a shot. You'll be glad you did. If you like this video, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Also, if you would like to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. If you would like to contribute but not sign up for my Patreon, you can always click the donate button up above. Thanks everyone for watching.